Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Warwick Powell, an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology and a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute. We want to discuss a bit what's happening between Australia and China, and in a second part, we will also focus on Japan a little bit. So, Warwick, welcome back.
Great to be back with you.
Glad having you. And I've learned that I really must suppress the urge to pronounce the second W in your name. People told me that, but let's let's actually focus.
It's okay. The English pronounce it with a silent W in the middle, and the Americans tend to pronounce the W explicitly, which of course is an odd thing because Americans don't pronounce the H in herbs, whereas the English will pronounce the H in herbs. So I don't know why, but it is just what it is. So
Not a consistent language, but none of them are. None of them are.
so whatever floats your boat.
Warwick, about Australia. Your prime minister currently recently went to China, and there's just really new signs to me, handshakes and happy faces and talk about a friendship and good relationship, and that really surprised me because Australia so far has been one of the spearheads of the Western alliance against China. Can you update us on what's happening there?
Look, as you say, the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese recently completed a 6-day diplomatic trip to China where he visited 3 cities, Shanghai, Beijing, and Chengdu. Each of these cities hosts an Australian government presence. So Australia has a consulate in Shanghai and in Chengdu, and of course, the embassy in Beijing. So it was, from an Australian point of view, I think, a very good thing for the Prime Minister to visit each of the cities where there is a permanent physical representation. Of course, in visiting these 3 cities, he also, I think, sought to accomplish a few other things along the way. And this is part of the combination of symbolic significance in diplomatic languages, where often actions speak louder than words, but also it created opportunities for him to deepen a series of relationships between Australia and China. So the depth of the relationship and the breadth was demonstrated by both the time that he spent in China and also by the fact that he visited a diverse number of places and undertook a diverse range of activities. There were meetings with senior business figures. There was, of course, curated meetings with government officials and a number of out on the streets moments. Now, all of that is carefully planned, as you and I both know, to ensure that there are, not only security questions when state leaders are out and about, but importantly also that they send the correct messages and there aren't any unintended diplomatic snafus along the way that could trip up the purposes of these trips. So on that score, the trip delivered, I think, some very important results. Symbolically, it demonstrated that that Australia sought to have good working relations with China. It showed that through the people-to-people engagement, visiting the Great Wall, the Panda Park in Chengdu, but also through the dialogues with business and government leaders. So on all of those fronts, the trip was an incredible success. So we can put all that aside in a sense because that really speaks to, I think, the professional ability of the teams involved in putting it together. What's strategically significant about that is, firstly, the reactions of certain sections of the Australian body politic and the commentariat. And I have no doubt we'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment, so I'll put that aside. But I think the other really interesting part of the trip was actually a remark that the Prime Minister made via social media that China is important to Australia in terms of the economy, which of course is well known, but also in terms of security and regional stability. And he brought those three ideas together in one tweet. This is, I think, the first time for a long time that an Australian Prime Minister, particularly in the context of discussions about China, has brought those three issues together into a cohesive proposition. That Australia's relationship with China matters to Australia's economic well-being and to security and to regional stability. And I think that's the significance of this particular trip.
So, do you think that this is part of a shift, not just of diplomatic signaling, but actually indicative for a change underlying also, in the bureaucracy and so on, where these kind of policy shifts they tend to take time, right? Because they're the outcomes of deliberations and even sometimes generational shifts within the apparatus. Did something not click, but did something kind of move toward, okay, we need to improve ties with China somehow?
Look, in terms of the immediate moment, the backdrop is the instabilities and the capricious foreign policy and defense policy posture of the Trump administration. And that's obviously thrown a rock into the pond. It's disrupted business as usual and the sort of comfort zone that countries like Australia have occupied for a long time. So in that sense, I think that has catalysed, if not a new thought process amongst the Australian policy establishment, it's certainly provoked a need to pay more attention to some of these issues. I think that there's another thing going on as well, and perhaps it's not quite a clicking yet, but this question of Australia, China, United States, and Asia is a fluid question, and it has been fluid for quite some time. The fluidity of this issue really sits on two broad questions, I think. The first question, so this is from an Australian point of view, though I think the question applies broadly as well, and certainly other capitals will be exercising their minds around these issues too. So the first question goes to the status and trajectory of the United States and its position in Asia. The question is, are we witnessing the progressive retrenchment of the United States in material terms from a position of primacy in Asia? And if so, is this retrenchment and the trajectory of that retrenchment something that can be stopped and turned around? That's the first issue. In other words, where is the United States at? Back in 1941, the Australian Prime Minister at the time made a pivot from the United Kingdom, the British Empire, as the Australian protector, to the United States. And he did so against the backdrop of what historian John Darwin calls the strategic abyss of the American Empire, of the British Empire, sorry. In other words, confronted with the collapse of the British Empire, Australia was left with no choice but to shift its security trajectory. So are we witnessing a 21st version of what was the British Empire's strategic abyss unfolding before our eyes today? The answer to that question is wrapped up in the way in which the second set of issues then get articulated, which is what then constitutes Australia's national interest? For 50, 60, maybe 70 years, and if we push back into the period of the British Empire days, Australia's general position was as a sub-imperial power. It intuitively and institutionally understood its interests to be 100% consistent with the interests of the superior empire under whose umbrella it sat. Therefore, what was good for the British Empire or what was good for the United States was good for Australia. That comfort zone is disappearing. So the debate that's now unfolding in Australia is around these two pivotal questions. And the Prime Minister's utterances, bringing those three ideas together in a single tweet, I don't think necessarily signals a fundamental shift in direction, but it does signal a recognition that there is a need to test the waters about how this issue is going to unfold and be addressed across the diversity of the Australian political landscape.
Yeah, that makes very much sense. And don't get me wrong. I mean, these tweets and so on can also be the outcome of just trying to flatter a little bit at the end of a trip and so on and so forth. But it is indicative that it is not these belligerent tunes that we are used to hear. So if there is indeed a bit more of a nuanced discussion going on, then do you think it goes hand in hand also with this assessment of the actual geostrategic position of Australia? Because as you said, for the longest time, Australia looked at itself as the most remote part of the Commonwealth, right? So the empire on which the sun never sets, and very proudly so. Then, of course, as a strategic ally of the United States. But geostrategically, Australia is the tail end, or situated at the tail end of Southeast Asia. And in what sense should Australia be under a greater threat than, let's say, Indonesia or Malaysia from the forces to the north, the east, or the west? How do you think is this discussion also of military security now shaping up in Canberra?
Look, there are different schools of thought, as I think you'd expect. There are clearly schools of thought which views China as a significant threat to Australia, and that has been drummed up over the last 8 or 9 years. The China threat proposition has loomed large and has dominated much of the thinking, and certainly created most of the noise in the public sphere. But it's not the only voice, and we do have a number of other perspectives that are intervening in the Australian national public policy debate. And it is intervening against the context of those two issues that I touched on. So many of these issues ultimately hang on one's assessment of the status of the American empire today and anticipated status going forward in Asia. So depending on your view of that, you will have a particular view on what will happen and how Australia may or may not be positioned in that. The second question is a normative one, right? Which is, regardless of your view or your assessment of the state of reality, what should it be and what ought you do? So we have scholars like Hugh White, who has been on your program before, who I think represents the extreme position, and I don't mean that in a radical sense, but on a spectrum sense, that the American empire is over. American primacy in Asia is a thing of the past, and Australia needs to get its head around a post-America future and figure out how it lives with China as the principal power in the region. That's the Hugh White position. There are other positions along the spectrum, including recent ones articulated by a former senior official from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Peter Varghese. Varghese penned an opinion piece that was published a week or so ago, in effect saying that Australia needs to recognise that the United States is no longer the single preeminent power in Asia, and that it is necessary to recalibrate its position. Varghese is not quite of the Hugh White position in terms of we're just going to have to learn to live with this. But nonetheless, the shift in Varghese's view, or at least my assessment that he's shifted a position, is significant because only 2 years ago, Varghese was one of the most articulate proselytizers of Australia's role as a sub-imperial power, as a beneficiary and defender of the rules-based order anchored by American primacy in the region. So there has been a shift in light of realities. Of course, unsurprisingly, there's been pushback from other quarters, which revolves around either an assessment of America's position, though increasingly, Pascal, there are fewer analysts and scholars who would argue that American primacy continues to exist. Right? That shift in assessment of the state of reality is important, because once you accept the proposition that American primacy is a thing of the past, you then have to confront other problems, which is, well, should Australia then work with the United States to somehow slow down the slide, or to create a new stasis in the region where the United States can play the role of a balancing power? Or should Australia work with the United States to try to contain China and boost the relative power of the United States into the future and reclaim something that looks like primacy? And of course, the language today that is used to describe that latter view talks about things like peace through strength, balance of power, where power and the balance is in, quote, our favour. And that's the Elbridge-Colby view of the world, right? And so when that kind of perspective is brought to the table, what they're really saying is that we, the Western powers generally, the United States and Australia, need to figure out a way of reclaiming a position of relative primacy in Asia. So this debate is unfolding now in Australia in a more intense way than it was apparent, say, 6 or 7 years ago, when the China threat crowd dominated the public space.
Okay, so there is a clear shift in the discussion, but also maybe in the recognition of what is still possible or desirable. At the same time, now last week we also had this bizarre moment when the White House just announced that it demands to know from Japan and Australia where they would stand if there was an actual war with China. You know, they want strategic clarity on where these two partners stand, but they themselves, of course, still have a strategic ambiguity toward like recognition of Taiwan and China, one China policy, but they want strategic clarity from the public. And this is bizarre, not just because it puts both of these countries in an awkward position, and it creates this kind of, oh, hey, who are you exactly to ask this question moment, but it also kind of it just puts a weird spin on what is happening, as if though, you know, the US is now demanding military commitments. How did the public or let's say the newspapers in Australia react to that, and what's your take?
Look, unsurprisingly, the reactions were split, and split along the lines of the sort of major camps of thought. But I think the first thing to remember about that particular intervention was that it was published in the Financial Times on the Saturday when Prime Minister Albanese landed in Shanghai. And my suspicion is that the timing and the leaking of that demand was not a coincidence. It was leaked to coincide with the visit to China in the hopes of putting a spanner in the works to disrupt the smooth running of the diplomatic trip right from the get-go, to put the Prime Minister into a position where he would have to answer awkward questions. I think that was the political hope, if you will. Now, I think the Prime Minister handled that issue, particularly whilst he was in China, in a particularly adept way, in that he did what I think seasoned politicians do, and that is to go back to script, because scripts give certainty without necessarily giving too much else away. And his response was simply that Australia doesn't support the unilateral change to the status quo, and that Australia will not entertain discussions about hypotheticals. The second part, of course, of the demand was that Elbridge-Colby has, over the course of the last month or so, been hammering Australia to make commitments to increase its defence spending to 5% of GDP. And the government so far has actually pushed back quite firmly and just said, look, Australia will spend what it thinks it needs to spend, and its spending commitments will be based on an assessment of what it needs, not as some artificial benchmark against GDP. So on two fronts, there has been some pushback. Now, I wouldn't make too much of that at the same time. It's really easy to look at these daily transactions and think, well, there's been a big shift. I think the idea of the United States trying to push Australia into a corner just simply doesn't play well, because people tend not to react well to that kind of game. But at the same time, there's no doubt that over the course of the last 15 years, Australia has become increasingly intertwined in the American military apparatus and network of power in Asia and in the Pacific. And, rhetoric and words isn't going to change that overnight. Australia is the host of a number of American facilities, including a significant intelligence facility at Pine Gap. Australian ports play host to American submarines and the American Navy. American soldiers operate out of bases in Australia through what they call the Troop Rotation Agreement. Troop rotation, of course, is really a euphemism for a permanent base, but we, flip the forces every 6 months or so. So the United States is now a permanent military occupant in that regard in Australia. And consequently, Australia is part and parcel of the American military network here. Now, if somebody said that, 6 months ago, they might have been criticised from particularly the neocons, who would say, that's an exaggeration. Australia is an independent country with its own agency and those sorts of things. But only a week ago, one of Australia's most strident China hawks, Michael Pezzulo, published a piece where he said Australia plays host to American physical infrastructure and American troops. Australia is part of the American power projection network, and frankly, we just have to accept that. If there's a war in Asia, the only way that Australia can avoid being accused of being a belligerent is if we kicked out the Americans, and that's outrageous as a concept. And in fact, because of all of that, Australia really should be part of joint war plans with the Americans. So the cat's been let out of the bag.
Yeah. That's just ridiculous. It's like okay, being dragged into a war, or being pushed into a war out of the lack of other options. Wow.
Yep. So the neocon, in a sense, the neocon par excellence, has actually revealed a sensibility that basically says, look, we're part of the American empire. Call it whatever you will, but we are. And frankly, because we are, we should have a seat at the table and be part of joint war planning. End of story. Now, I think that particular intervention is going to catalyze a reaction, because it laid out in very plain terms a very confronting truth, which, of course, if you avoid and ignore long enough, you can sort of pretend that this isn't the issue. But Pezzulo, in a sense, has done Australia a favour by saying, look, these are some realities. He's got a view as to what the response should be, which is all the way with the US of A. But I'm not convinced that that many other people in Australia will simply go, yeah, that sounds good, let's do it. I think it's going to force a much more intense public scrutiny of Australia's foreign policy position and its defence posture in Asia. And now, that brings me back, of course, then to the Prime Minister's trifecta. That is a window into how Australian public policy can begin to reassess all of these questions. You don't just look at defence security in isolation. We have to look at it in terms of Australia's economic security and well-being, obviously security, but also, importantly, regional stability, right? So suddenly we've gone from a discussion about Australia's bilateral relationships and being a junior member of a sub-imperium to Australia's role and its relationship with the biggest economy and country in the region, and how that relationship contributes to regional security, stability, and economic welfare.
Does it? You made this comment on Glenn Deason's podcast just a few days ago that ASEAN is already China's largest trading partner now, and China ASEAN's largest trading partner, and ASEAN has had over the last 10-15 years, an amazing push in prosperity and regional development, and also dialing down of conflicts from southern Thailand to the long-standing issue of Timor-Leste and so on, and everything stabilized very much and improved dramatically for ASEAN in partnership with China, but also partnership with Japan, partnership with Australia, partnership with even with the Europeans. Is there any appreciation that this is also an option, the ASEAN option for Australia?
Look, Australia does have an explicit policy objective, which is to deepen its engagement with ASEAN, particularly economically. Now, this has been, in a sense, part and parcel of Australia's generic understanding of the region, that Asia is where the world's most dynamic economies are. Australia's located close to Asia. There's a lot of upsides for Australia to be deeply engaged, etc., etc. Now, turning that ambition into rubber on the road has always been something of a challenge and remains a big challenge. Australia's trade relationships with China is intense. It's 30% basically of Australia's trade. But Australia's interactions economically with ASEAN remains very, very thin on the ground. But there is a strategic ambition to try to intensify that. I think ASEAN is an unsung hero, and many people outside of the region find it difficult to get their heads around an organization that doesn't sort of jump on the front page of the newspapers every day, lecturing somebody or another, or trying to wield a big stick over one of its members because somebody doesn't like what a member's doing. And yet it has been instrumental in actually delivering on those three issues, right? On economic well-being for its members, on economic and national security concerns for its members, by stabilizing the environment in the context of, the spirit of Bandung, really, that sense of neutrality, enemy of none, friends to all. And of course, it's delivered, by and large, an institutional grounding for regional stability. So ASEAN is an underestimated organization that brings together a very particular kind of energy in the region that has made significant strides, I think, towards the realization of those objectives. And it has done that, as you say, not by turning its back on others, but by actually opening its doors to others. And it doesn't close its doors on anybody. And that has proven to be an incredibly powerful posture. So there is a window of opportunity here, I think, for a country like Australia to think more strategically and deeper about how it relates to Asia and shift the question, Pascal. The discussion that we've had, in a sense, has been dominated by a particular kind of question, which is, will Australia sign up to war or not? That's been the dominant question. Mm-hmm. But a different question actually is, how does a country like Australia, with its history, its geographical location, its resources, etc., its attributes, bring something to the table that can contribute to the meaningful creation of economic prosperity, economic security, and regional stability? Mm-hmm. So it's a different order of questions about the role of countries, their foreign policy, economic policy, and defense policy that is so different to the dominant trope, right? Yeah. All the way with the United States, American primacy, or a 21st century version of regional peace and stability.
Yeah, that's the epistemic shift that we need, but not just in terms of national discussions, also in the way we conceptualize security in and of itself. Because at the moment, unfortunately, especially from the U.S. neocon and the European kind of war factions, the entire the debate is capitalized under the idea of deterrence. We need to deter because the other one is obviously evil, so therefore we need to make sure that they're scared, right? And what you're saying is like shifting toward thinking of how of how to think of this as a house and as something that needs to be built and needs to be strategically stable for everybody. And I know that the Japanese are also thinking about are struggling with the same issues, and in a sense they are in a very similar boat, not the same but similar, when it comes to the predicament that their big protector in the West is now definitely. I mean, the sun is setting on that one, whereas the rising sun is maybe not Japan, but it's definitely in the Middle Kingdom, and that you need to find a way to balance this also because of the path dependence, right? I mean, the matter of the fact is there is these troop rotation agreements in Australia. The matter of the fact is there are these base agreements in Japan. The deal for the 70 years for Japan has been we give you bases, you give us protection. And that deal is changing not just because of the Americans, but also because of the general way in which the multipolar world is now starting to work. What is your assessment of how the Japanese are approaching the same issues that Australia has to deal with?
Yeah, look, all these countries are confronting this common backdrop reality, which is that the United States' position in Asia is no longer what it once was. And so the assumptions of the past don't hold going forward, particularly the assumptions that the United States military is going to either be there for you on day one or be there as a backstop on day 5. That shift, I think, is causing strategic thinkers around the region, well, at sometimes, no doubt, some nightmares, because it's always easy when everything's predictable. But at the same time, it's causing them to reflect more deeply, I think, on their own nation's security, their own nation's national interest. As I mentioned earlier, Australia, I think, is having precisely this kind of debate, even if it's not explicit yet. And the situation in Japan seems to be a Japanese, in a Japanese context, engaging with exactly the same two problems. The declining primacy of America in the region, together with a need to reframe a Japanese sense of national interest, is demanding of Japan, I think, a level of strategic openness that it didn't need to bother with in times past. Now, that openness can go in many, many directions because there are many forces that are seeking to fill this sort of policy void or this strategic conceptual void, whether it's the hardcore nationalists or whether it's the constitutional defenders or whoever, right? So these moments, I think, are destabilizing in the short term because the old certainties have basically faded away. And my read of the situation in Japan basically runs something like this, that for the last 15 years or so, various administrations have sought to progressively squeeze open a little bit more room for a reinvigorated sense of Japanese identity and strategic autonomy, with very, very small s and very, very small a. This window by which they can do that has been created by the material reduction in American capacity and influence in the region, economically and militarily. The Americans have actually aided this by saying, look, you guys need to do more and you need to step up, etc., etc. And the predecessor of the current prime minister in Japan actually was in the White House a couple of years ago, and I think gave a very, very interesting and clever speech because his speech basically said, we shouldn't expect America to do it all. And don't you worry, Japan is there to, help out. That, of course, was in one sense a bit of flattery to the United States, but it was actually diplomatic code for, we know you can't do it, and we're going to start filling this void. So it was a double message. The current Prime Minister, who of course has some of his own domestic challenges at the moment as a result of the election, has also been a very strong advocate of a greater sense of Japanese autonomy as well. And he has provocatively, in times past, put on the table, not only the idea of an Asian NATO, but I think interestingly, a proposition that the Japan-America relationship should be one between equals, and that as part of that, Japanese forces should have bases in Guam and elsewhere in the Pacific, under the same extraterritorial arrangements that American bases operate under in Japan. Now, of course, the Americans flatly refused all of that and dismissed it out of hand. But it is, I think, reflective of a Japanese political leadership that is looking for ways to find some more space. There's, of course, domestic pressures, nationalism, and those sorts of things, which also give some impetus to this. But it just seems to me, observing from the outside, that there is a quiet discussion going on in Tokyo that America perhaps isn't really not going to be quite as dependable a bulwark as it might have been in the past going forward.
I think you're absolutely correct, and it's worth remembering that Mr. Ishiba, the current prime minister, is from the left wing of the Conservative Party. He's not actually a nationalist, at least. No, he's not a nationalist, and he was making that comment actually shortly before he became prime minister in an essay at the Hudson Institute, basically, just showing that he has some idea of what the strategic environment looks like, and more as a provocative kind of look. If you demand, because the US keeps saying, like, we want a fair relationship, it's unfair that we have to protect you but you don't have to protect us, and he just reminded them, look, the deal is not protection for protection, the deal is basis for protection. That's what we have been operating under. If you want to change that calculus, then, well, we might want something as well. But you're absolutely right. So also the fact that Japan is the political system is only gearing toward more differentiation among the parties and actually among the preferences, is only going to increase the pressure on kind of having a national debate about what a strategic way forward is for the country. In this sense, how do you? My assessment is that Japan is going forward will be politically not at all under one single roof, but it will be a large national process also politically. For Australia, is the internal dynamics a similar one, or is there more kind of a clear-cut power center from where strategic thinking will emanate from?
Look, in Australia, there has been, I think, a strong bipartisan consensus across the two major parties on questions of foreign policy and national defence or security policy. There are at times some difference of emphasis, if you will, and the extent to which those relatively minor differences get amplified is, of course, part of the political theatre of electoral cycles. I think one of the touch points, which will become an interesting one, because this will often demand a specific response as opposed to general rhetoric, is going to be the outcomes of the AUKUS review that is happening in Washington at the moment. So Elbridge Colby is leading a review of AUKUS. It's set against the backdrop of Colby's own view, which is that America's only problem really is China. America is limited in its resources. It needs to get out of all of its other theatres really and commit its efforts to to Asia, and he's not convinced that America can actually afford to provide Australia with the submarines as part of the AUKUS arrangements. And in fact, I think he's deeply concerned, based on congressional research and other information, that in fact the American submarine building industry can barely meet America's own requirements, let alone those of anyone else's. So Colby is well known for being skeptical of the merits of providing this kind of equipment to others. And in some respects, I think that that particularly the present government if the Colby Review delivered an outcome that kind of forced Australia's hand to walk away from the submarines. Now, I say that because the current government is officially committed to AUKUS. It made those commitments prior to the election before the most recent one. And it was, in a sense, forced to do so because the previous government, the Morrison government, had entered into an agreement, briefed the then opposition, and gave the opposition 24 hours to respond. Now, in the lead up to an election, with the China threat issue sitting at the backdrop, to leave yourself exposed to being accused of being weak on national security was considered to be a politically foolish thing to do. So the then Labor opposition quickly agreed to the AUKUS proposition, and so a bipartisan consensus was achieved. But I'm not convinced that the present government accepts that one, AUKUS will get delivered. But number two, I think at a certain level, there is a recognition that there are substantial risks. And those risks were actually highlighted by comments from a former Australian Treasurer and ambassador to Washington and current defence industry lobbyist, Joe Hockey, when he commented in the context of news of this Colby Review that from Australia's point of view, AUKUS and the submarines is the only show in town, and in fact there is no plan B. Now, that, of course, from a national security planning point of view, no matter what political stripes you have, raises a lot of alarm bells about the way that planning has been done over the last 15 years. These things don't emerge overnight. You know, the diminution of sovereign capacity to defend a country doesn't disappear in one parliamentary sitting. But the idea that, in fact, without AUKUS, Australia is essentially bereft of a capacity to organise its own defence is of significant concern to serious people in the defence and security landscape. So, but there's no doubt that very few people believe that AUKUS will get delivered, right? So Australia is now caught in a position where the policy is committed to a thing that increasingly there are doubts about its strategic relevance to start with, but also doubts about its operational reality. So if the AUKUS review gives Australia the opportunity to get out, I suspect it will. And that could spark the kind of more intense debate that you're sort of hinting at. But if it doesn't, then the debate's going to come from outside of the mainstream political parties to an extent, but also particularly from within the party of government at the moment. So the Labor Party won a very large majority at the last election. The downside with large majorities is that your support base feels that there is less need for it to be as disciplined as it once was. And so it starts to speak a lot more freely about contentious issues. And there is an emerging movement within the sort of Labor side of the fence around groups like Labor Against War, the War Reform Movement, etc., that is pushing very hard for Australia's own taking a step back from AUKUS and for a much wider recalibration of Australian regional security policy.
Yeah, and we now have some grassroots movements in Australia also saying like Australia should be neutral, and they are trying to gain momentum, and it's still far away from going anywhere to national policy and so on. But there are now diverse ideas.
Yeah.
And one more thing, and you just alluded to it. I think this is relatively new. Not just that we have an appreciation for the increased capacity of China, industrial, militarily, economically, and so on. I mean, that one has been there. But the last 3 years of war in and about Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, and NATO's engagement in it has kind of shown for the first time that there are real, hard, undeniable industrial limits to the United States of what it can produce, because we thought so far the military industrial complex was this overwhelming thing, and as soon as you put in an order it will be promptly fulfilled, right? And the US can make anything it chooses, especially this military things, but we now learn this is not true.
Yeah.
And for for Japan, maybe a little bit less because they already decided to try to create more capacity indigenously, although they're still very much dependent also, especially on on missile batteries and so on. But for Australia too, AUKUS and so and these infrastructure projects, is this also going to add now pressure to diversify away from this monolith that we thought had infinite capacity?
Well, I think this is one of the pivotal issues. This assumption that somehow you place an order and whatever it is that you order will arrive at some point in the not too distant future. I think that that sense of confidence in delivery systems is over. I think that there's another set of issues too, particularly in terms of military capability, and that is that the conflicts in Ukraine and also the situation in Gaza has demonstrated that assumptions about the overwhelming combat effectiveness of Western military technologies, that assumption is also proved to be unfounded. The idea of Wunderwaffe being able to somehow overwhelm an adversary, particularly a substantial peer adversary, that assumption I think is seriously in doubt. Well, from my own perspective, my analysis is that you might as well throw that assumption in the bin. Not only that, we've seen that the major platforms of American force projection globally, which is the United States Navy, have been found wanting, and we see that in the situation in the Red Sea, where for some months it's sought to, in effect, quell the Houthis in Yemen, and failed. And a ceasefire was ultimately agreed to as the United States Navy, its battle cruisers and its significant naval projection had to retreat out of the region. Now, all of that has been watched very, very closely by people around the world. And when you come to Asia, where much of the terrain is actually maritime, the extent to which America's naval projection can deliver that sense of overwhelming military capability, it's just not there anymore, and that's got to, shake people quite substantially. It's a very it will cause, I think, some deep anxieties in the collective West, because all of their assumptions have literally been exposed. So not only do we have, I think, limitations in productive capacity to replace and replenish what's being used, we actually know that the hardware itself and the technical capabilities are nowhere near as superior as one had assumed them to be.
And this is a long-term issue, right? You cannot just rebuild industrial capacity overnight, especially if the problem is that you kind of forgot how to do certain things. I mean, let's not forget, like Nippon Steel bought US Steel because Nippon Steel is just better at producing this stuff and has the capacity to maybe help US Steel to get back on its feet. But that will take time, right? And that's the level at where we are at when it comes to industrial capacity.
Look, if you look at even something as basic as 155 millimeter shells, the United States confronted the reality over the last 3 years of limited supplies, and it's sought to crank up its productive capacity. It hasn't met any of its targets, but it's also realized that the only way it could even increase existing production capability was to bring a whole bunch of people out of retirement. So there is a human skill question here, knowledge, skill, know-how, experience. But I also think that there's fundamentally an industrial design problem, which is a productive capability issue. And of course, there's a supply chain issue. Let's not forget that many of the inputs that the military-industrial complex actually depend upon are inputs that come from countries like China. And, a report by Pentagon consultants, Gavini, estimated that the American industrial complex, military-industrial complex, actually relied upon a supply network of over 10,000 Chinese enterprises for inputs. If you looked at the aircraft carrier, they're looking at about 6,000 different suppliers from non-American sources that actually make it possible for the United States to build and maintain, to the extent that it can, an aircraft carrier. These are very, very deep-seated problems. And on top of that, I think we actually have a combat capability issue too. And whilst it's not my area of expertise, it seems that things like hypersonic delivery capabilities and the ability or lack thereof to defend it against them is something that's currently not within the reach of the collective West, whereas Russia, China, Iran, and others have proven hypersonic delivery capabilities now, and that really has, I think, reshaped the relative balance of power. So when people like Elbridge Colby talk about peace through strength and having a balance of power in our favor, well, it's a long, long way away.
Yeah, no, it is. It's just since we are now in the in the issue of industry and so on. Like, let me also ask you about something that we briefly touched upon before I started the recording, which is this most recent announcement that Japan now has a trade agreement with the United States, but that it is a weird form of agreement that includes a direct investment, foreign direct investment component to it, while then lowering tariffs. I mean, completely artificially inflated tariffs that were used as a bargaining chip by the US or leverage to kind of squeeze Japan and squeezing others as well, right? Squeezing Australia as well, as you pointed out when we talked previously. The US has a trade surplus with Australia, but still slapped it with 10% tariffs. Anyhow, it's like, okay, because everybody gets tariffs. But that now the US seems to have this funny idea that what you need to do is to make sure that a foreign investment is somehow props up the US economy, which is not necessarily capability propping up. But can you maybe speak to that a bit?
Yeah, look, there are some interesting features of these sorts of agreements that the United States is seeking to enter into. Each of them, in a sense, turns on their own detail because they relate to industry structure. Trade's a funny thing because many people focus on the trade activity itself, but from my own perspective, I tend to look at trade really as a symptom of productive capability and its distribution.
Mm-hmm.
You can't trade what you don't produce. So this really is a question of productive capability and its distribution geographically. The issue of tariffs, it seems that the motor vehicle question is the most significant one around all of this. This idea of the trade imbalances with American cars not being accepted into Japan, et cetera. And the agreement that's been reached on the motor vehicle question seems to, as far as I can see, because the details are a bit scant, right? Tweets.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of details yet. The actual agreement isn't out. I kind of wonder if it exists.
Well, I've seen skerricks of reports which suggest that there is a reciprocal tariff of 15% on motor vehicles going both directions. that the United States will not be imposing any quota on Japanese-made motor vehicles into the United States market, whereas it has done that for some other counterparties, which means that, America will continue to import Japanese cars, but American buyers will ultimately have to, pay somewhere between an extra 1% and 15%. But the question of this, the other one was around agriculture. There has been some discussion on the rice question, and some reports suggest, though again, there's no confirmation of this, that Japan will open up its market on rice to American rice, but there will be no special treatment per se for American rice. But again, some of those details are sort of reported on the edges without any sort of solid confirmation. The interesting one is this investment question, right? So there has been an obsession from the White House as part of all of these announcements that somehow it's secured commitments from, all and sundry that they will invest in America. So remember the visits of President Trump to the Gulf states, where he came back with trillions of dollars worth of investment commitments.
And the check.
And the check, right? But when you actually understand the flows of capital in the relationship between trade flows and then capital flows, you actually realize that what we're talking about is what Japanese firms and the government would need to do with any US dollars that's accumulated through trade. And it's got to do something with them.
Yeah, because they sell Japanese cars in the US market for US dollars. They even largely produce them over there and then sell them in US dollars, and then you end up with a cash pile of US dollars.
So you have US dollars, and once you accumulate US dollars, decisions get made about what you do with that. Now, the first thing you do is that you hold some of those US dollars as US dollars, right? Because you need to have a reserve to be able to settle accounts progressively. So some of that's held as US dollars. The rest of it then gets converted into some kind of a security. So the Japanese central bank, of course, buys US Treasury bonds. So that's a way in which the US dollars are recycled back into American financial assets. Japanese holders of US dollars buy stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, and that converts it into equity in companies. Of course, these US dollars can also be used to purchase companies off the market, can purchase land, buildings, or what have you. So in a sense, this idea of securing these investment deals is largely meaningless, because a holder of a US dollar ultimately, unless they just want to hold a pile of cash that does not earn yield, is going to do something with those US dollars, right? And doing something means investing it in one shape or another. And usually a portfolio includes a diverse range of assets. So I look at these announcements around, we've secured all this investment, and just sort of shrug my shoulders and just think, well, what else are they going to do with the US dollars?
You could put you can take them out as $100 bills, put them on a ship, and bring them back to Japan. Of course, that's not what you will do. Of course not. So, in a sense, do you think? So, do you assess this as a way that the US is now doing some window dressing? As in, okay, we won, when in fact, okay, the Japanese now agreed to give you something that they would probably have to have had to do one way or another anyhow. Plus the rice, by the way, Japan is going through rice shortage this year. The price of rice has shot up. Funnily enough, the government still rather releases strategic reserves of rice than lower the cap on import restrictions, even towards Southeast Asia. But even that one, to me, strikes me as like less consequential. If they say like, okay, fine, we're going to import a bit more from the US and reduce from Thailand, it's too bad, because jasmine rice is fantastic. But it's just difficult to know whether the US actually got any substantial concessions now, or whether this is also done under the guise of trying to get a first real deal, so to put pressure on others.
Look, agreements to invest US dollars in America is actually a very easy thing for a foreign holder of US dollars to give. right? What else are you going to do with it? Right? This is as simple as, or you can buy, other foreign exchange, right? So, but at some point, these US dollars find their way back to something in America, whether it's to buy things from America or to invest in things. So in many regards, it is a bit of a non-event, but it can be dressed up because it makes it sound like the United States has gotten something from someone else. And when you have a financialized fetish, this idea that wealth is equivalent to dollar holdings, then getting those US dollars back in some way or another is easily presented as a commercial success. Now, as a commercial enterprise, that kind of logic is very understandable. But as a national economy, where you're essentially operating with, systems of, economic circuits, it actually doesn't make much sense at all. But the the message, I think, will resonate with many ordinary people because for people who don't get to print their own money, the idea of money coming in makes a lot of sense. But serious observers actually know what's going on and just sort of shrug their shoulders.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, national economies don't hinge upon the question of the length of the number in the balance sheet. The question is what is in the balance sheet.
Look, the other thing I should just mention, and for benefit of viewers, is that the United States, of course, is the creator of its own currency. Let's not forget.
Yes.
So the idea that somehow it needs to bring its money back from someone else is of course, inherently an odd idea. In terms of it being presented as somehow a win. The United States government is never short of money. It can never be short of money. And and so the question that often arises in my own mind is, why is this considered a win when it's just really monetary recycling?
Yeah, and the meaning of it is that there will be 550 billion US dollars of assets that are going to be held by Japanese instead of Americans. That's what it means. But we will see where this goes down the road.
Yeah, look, I mean, this issue, of course, of selling assets. So often in the discussions, particularly people who criticize, trade relationships will say, look, the deficit country ends up in effect selling the country out to the holders of its currency, who use it to invest. And but eventually the domestic politics will often resist that anyway, plus institutional setup, right? So foreign holders of American dollars, of course, own many American financial claims. US dollar treasury, treasury bonds is a classic case, or stocks on the stock exchange. And other forms of financial instruments. Very, very few foreign entities actually directly own American land and American businesses directly in whole. Very, very few. So in many regards, we already operate in a world where there is, to some extent, forms of capital control anyway. Yeah. And it's likely that as, more explicit foreign investment comes back into the United States by way of dollar recycling, the politics could get quite difficult because, and we've been there before, we've seen Japanese firms, emerge in the United States in the 80s, which caused incredible social anxiety. We've already seen it in parts of America in relation to Chinese investors in America. And in an environment where this sense of nationalism is very, very strong, I wouldn't be surprised if sometime over the next few years we'll have anti-Japanese investment reactions as well.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time, and it would only make sense. But we'll see. Warwick, thank you very much for your assessment. People who want to read more from you, I will direct them to your Substack and your Twitter. Anywhere else where they should go?
No, that'll do. That's enough.
Thank you very much, Warwick, for your time today, and talk to you again.
Great. Absolute pleasure.